Wow, great to see all of you out here. Really nice that so many people showed up to hear about this funny phenomenon called urban forestry and what it really is. So I hope that I can, from my own personal experience, give you a little bit of an insight into this emerging interdisciplinary field, as well as give you some ideas of where research is at these days. So what kind of topics are we looking at? What kind of breaking edge or boundary research is taking place? And how do I see, in my own humble way, how do I see the field developing in the near future? And it seems to be very timely to have that discussion here today, because I know that MSU, which has a very long history in urban forestry, Professor Jim Kilbasa, who is in the audience here, has been an authority on this for a long time. And MSU is again picking up on the urban forestry history and heritage and developing a new program, having a minor and maybe more in the future. So that's really excellent, I think. And I will also share a little bit of my experience from UBC in Vancouver, where we just set up a new Bachelor of Urban Forestry. And we had actually, this year, my first year, we had 54 students, full-time students in the program, and 94 students in the Introduction to Urban Forestry course. So that shows that urban forestry is a kind of an interesting field for a lot of young people now to get into, and also some not so young people. So that's really, I think, encouraging for us in the natural resource professions. Well, many of you, of course, are very familiar with the kind of context, the kind of scenery we're talking about here. We talk about a world that is now primarily urban. Science, not so long ago, had it cover stating that we're living on an urban planet, with all the consequences that has. We're living in a time also characterized as the Anthropocene, a geological era which is impacted by human beings. So quite dramatic in terms of the impact that we have on our natural environment, on our forest and our trees. So this, of course, also sets the scene for the field of urban forestry, which is really, I guess, the efforts of the natural resource professions and the design professions to really adapt to this urban phenomenon, this urbanization of many aspects of life. How do we deal really with trees and nature in our cities, in these artificially created environments? How do we make sure that we keep people in contact with nature, also when, in principle, we're moving further and further away from the land? In my urban forestry class, I asked the students, I said, whom of you actually has a background in agriculture or has family coming from agriculture? And there were, I think, 2 or 3 students that raised their hand and said, we were brought up in an agricultural setting or a village. So I said, whom of you actually had grandparents who came from an agricultural background? And maybe half of the room put up their hands. I said, okay, do you know further back how it was looking with your relatives? And many of them then put up their hands. So it actually showed that within 2 or 3 generations, actually we have moved away from the land. I can go back 2 generations, and my grandparents were fishermen, they were farmers. But when I look at my parents and I look at the generations that have come after that, everybody is kind of growing up in urban areas. So that is really a dramatic shift. That means also that the students that we get into the university systems today are largely urban, and they come with urban mindsets. And that, of course, is something that we have to be aware of as well when we teach them. And we put expectations on them of how to behave in forest, etc., which is not always so obvious for students today. So luckily we are, those of us, and I say we, those of us in urban professions, urban forestry, we are also getting the attention of the high-level policymakers. So this is the United Nations who have developed their development goals, the global development goals. And they talk, for example, about the fact that many of us live in urban areas now, and they talk about the need to create or to ensure access to green spaces for everybody. Equitable access, and they mention especially groups that tend to be marginalized in urban areas when it comes to access to services like children, women, elderly people, people with disabilities, but also people with different cultural backgrounds. So the United Nations systems is gearing up towards this integration of urban green spaces into its agendas, which is really a new thing, something we haven't really seen so much. Organizations like WHO, the World Health Organization, UNEP, the Environmental Protection Organization, they're all now incorporating an urban agenda. And not only an urban agenda, but also an urban green space agenda, which is really a major shift. So the times are there, I think, for us, urban green space professionals, urban foresters, to kind of look at ourselves as well and say, well, where do we come from? What do we stand for? Who are we? It's a good question that you can ask in many different contexts, but of course here it's also important. This is a definition of urban forestry dating back several decades now. Robert Miller, famous professor at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, coined it and was later adopted also in the dictionary of forestry. Something about this field, wide-ranging field, that deals with community ecosystems, but especially also with how these ecosystems and local communities, human communities, are interacting. And how do we optimize the benefits, trees, forests, other natural lands, what they provide to us? How do we look at all these different benefits that nature and trees provide? So this is a definition that has been driving our work in many different ways. And based on that, you can say there have been two major lines of development. We've either been bringing back forests into the city, be it single trees like here in Copenhagen. We've been trying to retrofit our cities by bringing green space and trees back, where we had lost them before. An ultimate example of that is a place where I had the pleasure to work a few months last year, Hong Kong. Super dense. It's the city in the world where most people, I think the average population of Hong Kong lives on the 19th floor or higher. So you can imagine the kind of consequences. If you want to use your green space, you have to go 19 floors or more down first and then go out. But then there are these pockets of green space. There are a lot of fantastic trees, ficus trees that are kind of hanging on stone walls, pocket parks, etc. So even in a very dense environment like Hong Kong, you will see trees everywhere. And then you can go out to the county parks and then you see fantastic kind of wild forests where people will go in the weekends en masse, really big groups of people with radios, listening to traditional Chinese music, and then they're going up the hills in the county parks and they come back. So people are still connected with green space in many ways as well. So from that idea of bringing the forest back into the city, of course other cities have had the opportunity and the luck that have developed into the city, so a city in the forest. And some of you might know this city is one of my favorite cities in the world. It's Vancouver. And Vancouver is really a city that has a fantastic urban forest heritage, a rich canopy, and also very fortunate, of course, to have this dramatic mountain and sea landscapes around. But there can also be an issue that Vancouver takes too much for granted sometimes. So the tree canopy in Vancouver is dropping. They have an ambition to be 22% canopy. They're actually below 17.5% right now. And the city of Vancouver is kind of desperate because they have the bylaws to protect the trees. But they can only protect really the bigger trees, the public trees. So they lose a lot of the private trees with densification and population growth. So the forest in the city can also look like this. This is Lighthouse Park Point in North Vancouver. Quite dramatic, wild settings. When I brought our kids there, they couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe they were in a city and then also be in a forest like that. Climbing over big logs, seeing those big, fantastic cedar trees standing around. And there are spots like this in many of our cities still that we have to be really careful with because they really represent a wilder kind of nature that we should not forget in all this. I think there's also kind of a public ground for what we do, a public awareness ground. So a lot of people today are interested in trees. You see a kind of a rapid increase of these tree guides. The Vancouver Tree Book, for example, was on the top of the book-selling list for a long time, months and months. Because people are interested. They want to know what kind of big trees there are in the city. They want to know what kind of species there are. And they're really eager to learn more about trees. So have some of you come across this book as well, The Hidden Life of Trees. This is a German forester, Peter Wolleben. And he had this interesting thoughts when he was going out in his forest and looking around. He said, there's some things happening here that I, with my scientific knowledge, my training, simply don't understand. Trees are communicating with each other in ways that are not really predictable or that I don't know really from the theories. So he developed this kind of idea that trees communicate with each other, also between different species through their root systems. And they can warn each other, they can help each other in times of shortage of food, etc. Kind of a radical idea. I was in forestry, of course. When I was in forestry school in Holland, I learned all about competition, interspecies, between species, competition for light and nutrients. All of a sudden, I read this book and think, okay, maybe there's a paradigm here that is slowly started to change. And one of my colleagues at UBC, Suzanne Simard, professor there, she's actually done some really good research on this. And she's continuing that on 3 or 4 tree species, seeing how they actually interact with each other through their root systems. But this, again, was a bestseller, still a bestseller in Canada, in Vancouver. This is on the #1 of the non-fiction list and has been there, I think, for half a year now. So people actually do like trees. They are interested in forest. They're interested in nature. So urban forestry has something to build on. We have developments in society, we have policy, we have people interested in trees. And then there's all these developments that some of you will recognize. There's some of you in the room here that I've met in different conferences all over the place. There is a lot happening. There's a lot of networking. There's organizations like the International Society of Arboriculture, there's IUFRO, there's all these different books and conferences. So there's a kind of a growing international community of urban forestry scholars. And sometimes we don't call ourselves urban foresters maybe. We call ourselves urban ecologists or urban planners, landscape architects, environmental psychologists. But we all gather and assemble around the idea of trees and nature in our cities. And that is really a fantastic thought. And I'll show you some examples of how the field has been growing. Urban Forestry, Urban Greening, as Bert said, was a journal we set up in 2002 with a small German publisher. It was Kjell Nilsson, Thomas Randrup, and myself. We were contacted by the publisher who said, there's this thing called urban forestry. And there's a few people like you that are working with it. Do you think there will be ground for a journal? So we said, yeah, you know, there's ISA, we have the Journal of Arboriculture, that's probably enough. I said, no, we think we should go a little bit broader. So we launched this journal, Urban Forestry and Urban Greening. The first year, we were really begging to get papers. I think we had 20 articles submitted. We probably published all of them. I don't think we had any rejection rate at that stage. I checked the other day for what our submission were last year, which is kind of 12, 13 years down the road. We had 550 papers submitted. Urban forestry papers in some way. Anything from green roofs to public health, landscape planning, tree pruning, tree establishment, nursery production. It's a wide range in scope of papers. And you see also in terms of who is writing these papers. We have a dominance still, of course, in the West, North America, and Europe. But you see places like Southeast Asia, Australia, etc. A lot of people are writing about urban forestry. So there's definitely a growth. And even more interesting when you start looking at where people are downloading papers from urban forestry, urban greening, all over the place. Africa, Latin America, people are reading our papers. So there is a huge interest in urban forestry research. And as I said, it's widely defined. A lot of people say, oh, I didn't even realize this was urban forestry. But that's really showing the kind of richness in terms of studies, approaches, PhDs that are coming into the field, young people that feel, you know, I grew up in an urban center. I grew up in New York or Rio de Janeiro, Ouagadougou. I don't want to work out in the forest. I want to be here in the urban area. Finally, I can work with nature, actually in the urban area. So there is really something there to the field of natural resource management that we can tap into, I think. So in the next part, I would like to just introduce you to some of the research that is emerging, has been well established in some cases, but in other cases also really being lifted during the last years. So some of the topics in the papers from UFUC in 2016 really show that there are some kind of main categories emerging. There's a lot of good work on urban tree growth. How are we managing to have trees in the city that grow well? There could be anything from nursery production, having the right kind of trees planted, to pruning, etc. Really, how do we make trees grow in this harsh environment called the city? Because, of course, most factors in the city are working against the trees. There might be some positives like community engagement and kind of irrigation and things, but most factors are actually working against the trees. Trees are in kind of a war zone. They have to all the time try to survive. So that's the one. The second group of papers that is really coming up is public health benefits of urban trees, urban green spaces. So there's a lot of work on what kind of benefits do we get out of trees? And I will show you some examples of that soon. There's also kind of an interesting body of knowledge emerging on how different people also have different perceptions and uses of green spaces. Looking, for example, at different age categories, different cultural groups, looking at people with different incomes, etc. And showing really how complex this is, how complex the interactions between people and trees are. Well, in the country of iTree, of course, I don't have to tell you that there's a lot of work going on in terms of the environmental, regulatory ecosystem services of urban forests. Climate change adaptation, carbon sequestration, air pollution reduction, and all the whole modeling of benefits around that. Then my own area of research very much is urban forest governance. And the term governance, as we know, of course, is pretty new and really talks about complexity of decision making. So while we talked about government-regulated urban forestry for long periods of time, today we talk about all kinds of actors that are deciding on the urban forest. And then finally, and I know that's also a topic that people here at MSU are very interested in, there's an interest in creating more diverse urban forests, more resilient urban forests, looking at tree diversity, looking at how tree diversity has changed over time. Some people here in the audience have been doing some excellent work on that, looking at tree inventories over time and changing tree composition. So to just give you a few of examples there. So tree growth, things like tree survival is not enough. It's not enough that we have trees that can just barely hang on there on their fingernails trying to survive in the city. Trees should be working, they should be producing, they should not only survive, but they should thrive. So how do we make that happen? How do we look at impacts of climate change, of microclimate, of soil conditions, etc., but also human factors? How do people interfere or interact with tree growth? And of course also we have all these small issues in terms of diseases and pests that are actually making our work more and more complicated. Diseases that pop up, it seems, every single time, new things that emerge, every time we have just replaced our urban forest and a new disease comes along. And this is of course driving a lot of the agendas and a lot of the policy attention, a lot of the budgets of decision makers today. How do we make our trees survive in times of increased disease and pests? I said already that trees are really clinging on there. Well, this is literally what happens here in the famous ficus wall trees in Hong Kong. But also here you can imagine, if one of these trees comes down, as has happened recently in Hong Kong, the public debate again emerges. These are iconic trees. They're part of Hong Kong. They're part of Hong Kong's heritage. But there's a public safety issue then. Should we take away all of these trees? These trees are not really doing very well on the new walls of Hong Kong. They don't stick in the same way. So there's long debates, big debates, even between some pro-nature, pro-green people who say, no, we can't have these trees because they give trees a bad name. That already shows that, urban forestry is not only about the technical skills, it's not only about risk management, it's not only about benefits, it's also about the deep emotional ties and the big conflicts that can be associated with trees. And that is, of course, one of the issues that we also deal with very much in urban forest governance research. Public health. This is a map that WHO produced not so long ago, and it shows the level of inactivity of teenage girls. Basically, the reddest areas on the map are the areas where the biggest share of the teenage girls is least active. So WHO has certain standards for physical activity, like modest activity for an hour a day, and I think intensive activity for half an hour a day. You see, large part of the world are in a situation now where teenagers are not sufficiently active. They're static. Most of their activities are taking place sitting behind a computer or checking their phones, sitting somewhere. People are not active. What is the health connection to urban green space? Well, if we can create green spaces, urban forests that are sufficiently attractive also for teenagers to go to, if we can get kids out to nature, then we can maybe break some of that inactivity pattern. And maybe the way to go is not just to create indoor gyms where people can hang out and do their stuff and pay a lot of money, but there could be things to be won there probably in our nature areas as well. But it's a difficult sell. I mean, teenagers in green spaces and nature, as we know, is not always the best cocktail. So we have 2 teenagers at home, so I know. I mean, we're very green, my wife and I, but we have big, big troubles with one of them, the boy. We can't get him out of the house with a stick. So we always have to kind of lure him into it, say that there's a hamburger waiting in the end of it or something like that. Yeah. But I mean, efforts are underway. People are using all kind of interactive approaches, geocaching, GPS hunts, trying to make green spaces cool again. There was a very interesting piece of research done in the UK a few years ago, Simon Bell and colleagues, and they looked specifically at teenagers in Scotland. And they noticed that a lot of teenagers in Scotland were hanging out in the forest. So they started asking these kids, well, why is it, teenagers are not supposed to be in nature? Why are you in the forest? And these Scottish kids, they answered, nobody watches us here. We can be here without any control from our parents or any other adults. So we can be here in our own safe zone. We can do whatever we want to do. And they will not control us. So that's of course interesting as well. So teenagers might have an interest in going to some green areas or green spaces. But there might be certain facilities one has to put into place. Meeting places, not being under the control of adults maybe all the time. But of course that also can have then consequences on the other users of the green spaces who might feel offended and threatened by groups of loitering youths in the forest. So it is complex, as said, especially when our green space is not so big often. Yeah, and then of course we also realize that some parts of the world, according to predictions and meteorological modeling, within the next 10 to 20 years, there will be part of the Arabic Peninsula that will simply be impossible for human beings to be outside certain times of the day because of temperature increases. So if it would not be for air conditioning, for example, people would simply not be able to live in those places. But here on the other end, we're building football stadiums, we're making all kinds of big constructions where people there, we have actually brought over from places like Bangladesh and India. They have to work hard, and of course the conditions are poor and terrible for those people. People die really by the thousands in these big construction projects. And the little bit of respite from those terrible conditions they can get is the shade that is provided in some of these areas. So this shows really the kind of crucial role that we have with green space. I mean, not to solve the world's problems, because we won't be able to do it, but at least to moderate some of the effects of the things that are happening. And places like Dubai are definitely where we have to go. But I mean, even places in Texas or other parts of the US will face increasing heat. They will face the issue of canopy. And not only, I mean, can we create places that are shaded, have water, which is of course very good element for cooling, but these will also be fantastic meeting places. And one of the issues that is not on my 6-point list there is social cohesion and the need for people to meet across cultures, across age groups. And where do you do it? Yeah, you can do it in the football stadium, you can do it in the mall, but you'll be controlled, you'll be in certain circumstances. Where you can do it democratically, without any conditions and any pressure, is the park or the green space. So there's a big role, I think, for green spaces as democratic spaces as well. Democratic meeting places where we can build social cohesion and keep in contact with the people around us. Like here in this old Chinese photo from the late 70s, that really shows, I mean, meeting in green spaces, being out in the green space with your friends and your family is cross-cultural. Everywhere in the world you'll see people sitting under trees, interacting in green space, and generally looking happy as well. I mean, how often do you go to the park and see people being obviously miserable? Usually people are quite relaxed and happy in parks. And there are things happening with us, of course. Research shows that when you go to green spaces, heart rates drop, stress levels drop, cortisol levels drop. So I always tell my students, you know, if you're stressed for a moment for your final exam, don't go on your phone, don't go watch TV, go out to nature, try to decompose and deconstruct your stress levels. And usually they say it actually works quite well for them. And I think another very important thing to realize there is that green space, of course, is very local. Trees are very local. This is my own backyard or my own front porch with the street trees in Kitsilano in Vancouver. So of course we make those little connections by the green around us. And we build those kind of space-place connections that are making ourselves at home in places as well. And there's connections here between, for example, pocket parks, as here in Copenhagen, you see some examples here, and health. So some research done by a colleague, Karin Peschardt in Copenhagen, it shows that these kind of pocket parks have two main functions. One is to act as meeting places. So people who come there and meet on the way from work or to home or just have a brief meeting with their friends or family. And the second is restoration. People that are stressed after work, on day of work, stressed because of traffic, they will sit down in a pocket park and they de-stress. But yet what we do, we're removing all these places. We're removing all these small green spaces because they're expensive to manage, they're not big parks, they're not type A nature. So we take out all these small neighborhood green spaces. We take out all these green trees that are standing there somewhere in the middle of a dense area. Well, we kind of underestimate, I would say, their fantastically important benefits. These are two girls when they were a little bit younger, but they obviously enjoy being out in nature. And that has something to do with children needing wildscapes. They need unplanned, unprogrammed landscapes as well. We kind of over-design our playgrounds. We're worried about risks and everything has to be safe, etc. But where kids grow up, where kids actually can stimulate their creativity, is not just playing on the iPad. It's also being out in nature, engaging with each other. We know that, of course, from Richard Louv's book. We know it also from a lot of good research that says basically when kids are out in nature, they're more creative, they're better in making friends, they're less aggressive, they have better motor skills. All these benefits that we lose actually by disconnecting people from, or kids especially, from nature. So organizations like the Children in Nature Network, they're really trying to boost our attention and policymakers' attention for children's access to nature. I supervised a PhD study a couple of years ago, Inge Leerstrup, and she looked into the phenomenon of forest kindergartens in Denmark. So the Scandinavian countries, they have this fantastic tradition that the kids come all dressed up on a cold winter day. They're driven out to the school by the parents, then comes a big bus, and the bus takes all the kids to the forest, nearby forest. And the kids are out all day. There's no buildings, nothing. So they're sitting there getting cold and miserable, but after a few days they get used to it. And they have their little sausage, and they have all kind of learning outside, they play, etc. So Inge did a study, and she said, well, what is it actually in those environments that makes children generally happy? Because children are not miserable when they go out to the forest. So she showed, when she compared the kind of traditional playground with a forest environment, that the forest environment is much better in stimulating children's play. There are loose elements, there are ditches, there's all kind of unexpected things happening. There could be small fires happening that the teachers put up. There could also be insects or animal encounters. So basically, really, what the forest did is stimulate kids in a very different way than us just programming their play in a traditional playground environment. And she used the theory of affordances to kind of see, well, what kind of affordances can we create and help create in the forest for children? And then when I talk about different people and different demands, of course, well, these times in the world, we look at huge migrations of people. Be it in China, where rural populations overnight become urban. Like this lady here that basically woke up all of a sudden to realize, I'm in an urban area. I'm now in an apartment building, while a few weeks ago I was still in my little farm here. How do you deal with that? How do you make sure that people connect with place and don't lose the connections they have with place? Because we know when we lose connection with place, we lose home, people can be really suffering from that health-wise as well. Or these two young Syrian boys that came to Germany as refugees, they come with their expectations, of course, and their fears and all their different feelings. And we'll also have to bring them a home, also in terms of green space and nature in their neighborhood. So just to add to the complexity of our work, there's all these different expectations, all these different millions of wishes and demands on these few trees and green spaces that we have. And then we also have to realize that some people don't like green space. This is an actual sign in Central Park. So that's also, a matter. Trees are not always good. It's very easy for us always to say, well, trees are always good. Well, they're not always, unfortunately. There are a few cities in the world that look fantastic, have very few trees. Venice is one of them. So it depends, of course. Trees are usually good, but we have to be a little bit aware that some people, probably it was more about the people here, of course, than the trees. So trees are great placemakers. So whatever people want and think, trees in general will enhance scenery. This is a fantastic tree in Kowloon in Hong Kong. So they really help us to make those connections between place and space. So on the one hand, place where we engage with, we're close to our local environments, and people like Yi-Fu Tuan and others have written about this. So we try to move along that gradient from space, which is the unknown, the adventurous, the wild nature that is maybe a bit dangerous, and then all the way to our home green environment. And somewhere along that continuum, we try to place ourselves every time when we interact with an urban forest or a nature environment. And we need both. We need, of course, place, we need home, we need connection and identity. But we also need the space of challenge, of adventure that kids need, for example, when they start engaging with nature and start getting out and facing those challenges as well. So, and of course, space and place, as you know, many of you will know, it relates not only to the spatial environment, but it's very much also a social phenomenon, how we interact with other people engaging with the space. As well, of course, we have to realize there's a political and cultural context. If I see a tree in Vancouver, a cherry tree, I'll probably see something very different than a second-generation Japanese immigrant who sees a cherry tree and makes connections to their heritage back home. There's research now, or articles coming out in Vancouver, that show that placing trees in certain spots along streets and in front of houses is culturally not seen as appropriate because of feng shui in Chinese cultures, but also in Hindu cultures. They say, well, no, certain trees should definitely not be placed close to a home because it brings bad luck. So people are protesting against public trees because of cultural insensitivity. So these are, again, things that we really have to be very aware of and just, again, enhance the complexity. So place and space, there's a lot of interesting things. I won't go into much detail here, but it really is kind of a good tool of understanding our connections to environments. And then there's also all these disservices. Many of you probably have seen in the literature, there's a kind of a rapid increase of articles on ecosystem disservices. And it's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think. Sure, nature, some things of nature we don't like. A tree falls over, tough luck, a storm comes by. Yeah, these things are not very nice. But to call it a disservice of nature, I think is maybe putting our anthropocentric vision a little step too far. Anyway, there are, of course, issues in terms of barriers that people have towards using green spaces. Be it Zika virus, as here in a Chinese city, or being Lyme's disease, Borrelia, transported by ticks. And these are real problems. Healthcare systems in different countries are facing increasing numbers of people with Lyme's disease. They're also faced with increasing numbers of people who say, I'm not going to the forest, I'm not exposing my children to this, because it's too dangerous. And that, of course, is a huge pity, because that means that also some of those good benefits that we talked about are not brought forward to people, because they simply don't want to go there. Talk about wild animal encounters, cougars, mountain lions, wild bears in Vancouver. People can easily find a lot of reasons not to go to the forest. I said also this topic of environmental services is hugely popular in the literature. There's a lot of work going on. This is just an example of iTree being implemented in the city of London, UK. 8.4 million trees being seen through the iTree lens there. Really trying to put the targets or the numbers on the benefits of trees. Focusing on things like climate adaptation and, of course, also air pollution reduction. Then there's really been this kind of dramatic shift in how we deal with decision-making in urban forestry. I said back in the old days, maybe not so long ago, I remember those days where it was basically cities deciding. They decided basically on what happened with the trees in the city. Maybe not the private trees, but they were kind of off anyway. So there was 80% of the trees out of the picture already. But the 20% of the public trees then, they were really taken care of by a very hierarchical public system. Well, those of you who have worked in communities across the world know today it's very different. There's a lot of interest groups, there's a lot of businesses that are involved, there's different levels of government that often have contradicting agendas. So you end up in this kind of melee or mix of opinions and tools and ways of dealing and managing with the urban forest. So this issue of governance and how we enhance our decision making, how we also kind of highlight who decides and who is involved in decision making, and not in the least also who wins and who loses. Who gets the benefits of the trees or not having the trees, and who loses there as well. Because this is, of course, a very political decision we make. Whenever we make a decision, there will be somebody who will benefit more than somebody else. And that will be one of the challenges we have to face as well in urban forestry, because we won't be able to put trees everywhere. And we have to understand the complexity of governance in terms of different approaches, models, from government regulation to collaborative governance to self-governance of local communities. But also things like, what kind of resources do people bring to the table? Who has the power? Who has the money? Who has the information? Who has the media? All these kind of things. The discourses, the storylines that are playing in. What are we talking about? Is it climate change, public health, children's learning? There's a lot of different things we talk about. Safety issues, emerald ash borer. All different storylines that will all play into our urban forestry agenda and arena. So this is a bit of work we did in Europe a couple of years ago, and this shows, we asked people in different cities in Europe, green space managers, what do you expect of all these different groups? Who is going to be more involved in the future of urban forest governance? And as you will see, all of them said, well, basically everybody will be more involved. We expect the scientists, individuals, communities, other professionals to be more involved in urban forestry decision making. This is not going to change. We're not going to be more in charge as professional urban foresters. We'll be facilitating. We'll be trying to help people make decisions based on informed information. But there's really a complexity emerging in different parts of the world. And you see also a need there for people to move across scales of governance. So where in many cases we look very local, we look at our local neighborhood, the district, and maybe the city level, we start talking about metropolitan area, watersheds, regions, metropolitan regions like Greater Vancouver, even national level urban forestry strategies. So what we need is people who can actually broker between those levels, who can be governance or policy brokers, who are actually able to kind of take things up from the local and bring it up to the federal, national, or even international, but also the other way around. And that turns out to be a really big challenge. Already when we go across a municipal boundary, things become very much more complex. And in many countries, we've seen a trend actually that these kind of medium levels of government have fallen away. The provinces, the regions, they've lost planning power. And there's the local and there's the national. And then in the US, I guess, the states. But there's really nothing in between. And this is a huge issue for landscape planning, as we have seen in the literature as well. Just to show you, and some of you heard this story early this morning, my apologies, but just to show you the complexity of governance and of being a willing politician with a green heart and a love for trees, still things can go very wrong. So this gentleman here is Mayor Gregor Robertson of Vancouver. He's a leading figure into the kind of greening of cities movement worldwide, and he's really eager to make Vancouver a green city. Green in its heart, green in its exteriority as well, its expression. But one of the things he really likes is bicycling. So he realized, well, one thing we need to do to make Vancouver sustainable is to promote soft traffic, especially bicycling. So he puts in cycle tracks all over the city, or wants to put them in. And that has gone well in many parts of the city where some of the poorer populations have lived. People have kind of swallowed it and took it, okay. It's a bit messy, we'll have construction, sure, but then at least these paths will come in. Maybe something good will come out of it. But then he moved to a neighborhood called Point Grey, which is the west part of Vancouver. Very affluent neighborhood. People with very good professions, good networks, political influence. And these people started realizing that for that greater good of better cycling facilities, they would have to sacrifice 2 meters of their private gardens, they would have to sacrifice a few trees, they would also have to sacrifice a year of maybe parking on the usual spot. So all these people that probably were very supportive of Mayor Robertson initially, they started saying, you know, Mayor Robertson, you're cutting our trees, you're axing our trees. This is a terrible thing you're doing. But of course, when public events started emerging, discussions started taking place, the real stories came out. It was not really so much about the trees that looked pretty miserable in the first place in many cases. There were, of course, other issues at hand. It was very much a NIMBY approach. Fine with greening, fine with nature, fine with a green city, but not in my backyard. I have my garden, I have my sea view, so why would I support the greater good? So not easy for somebody like Gregor to deal with that, of course, and then to try to be re-elected as well on an agenda like that. Not everybody is Mayor Daley, I guess, of Chicago, who can sit for 24 years or what it was. He's been there for 10 years, though, or 8 years, so he's doing well. And the complexity of access as well to green spaces. This is some really interesting work done recently by Jason Byrne, an Australian colleague. He did work in Los Angeles and some of the areas in the San Bernardino hills, etc. And he was really interested in how different people of different ethnic backgrounds, different cultural groups, perceived access to nature areas, recreation areas near Los Angeles. And it turned out that Latino populations, they often felt, you know, we don't go to these areas because we don't feel welcome. This is not meant for us. We are not supposed to be here. There's no information going out to us. When we go there, we feel unwelcome. There's other kinds of people, maybe more kind of white people using these areas. So we don't feel we should go there. And I think when you look into some of the research, it actually points in this direction, that it's very easy for people to feel excluded or to be excluded from green spaces. And of course, we have to be aware of that cultural groups, different groups, they might require different incentives in order to be able to enjoy those benefits that, of course, are supposed to be there for everybody. So this has very much to do with things like power and information and cultural differences. All right, and finally, tree diversity. So there's a lot of interest, as I said, on diversifying our tree populations. But there are debates come up about native versus exotic species. How do we diversify? Are we really diversifying too much? Because people also like kind of these fantastic monocultural lanes and avenues. So how do we deal with that? A lot of debates about approaches to that. Shanghai in China, terrible from a tree diversity perspective. One tree species, one age, maybe even a clone, who knows? Of course, people love it. So what do you do? How do you mix in diversity? How do you create a visual impression that is still what people want, but also the kind of ecological diversity that makes this more resilient and tolerant? And maybe this is not exactly the way to go. This is Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. Big artificial trees towering over the human, saying, you're actually very small. We are in charge here. No, I'm just joking, of course. But it is an interesting phenomenon, this kind of artificial trees that we see popping up, be it as cell phone towers or this kind of thing, artworks, where trees are really put on a pedestal and tower over humankind in a way as well. So a little plug here. We just finished editing this book. It will come out in a month or two, I should say. The Routledge's Handbook of Urban Forestry. And here we really try to capture some of this new research and try to really see what's going on in urban forestry in the world right now. And we have a lot of authors from North America, Europe, also Asia and other parts of the world. Really try to make up a status of urban forestry today. And then you see that other things are, of course, emerging, apart from those 6 themes that are presented. Things like greening of walls and roofs, like the Bosco Verticale here in Milano. Criticized as well as applauded. Fantastic image, of course, very much architectural. People love to see it. But if you live in that building, you're very limited. You're not allowed to do anything to the green spaces. It's all very much regulated. The image kind of dominates the livability of the place. So interesting discussions again. Who is in charge? Who rules the green space? And who determines who loses and benefits? Some of you might have come across, this is the newest thing in European policy and European research. It's called nature-based solutions. And there's a long definition there about being inspired by nature in finding solutions, technical solutions, to the challenges in society today. Well, you know, if you look at it very carefully, I would say there's probably one big solution to all of that, and that's actually planting more trees or managing your trees better. Trees are the ultimate nature-based solution. But of course, the European Commission, who's doling out the funding for these programs, they're not funding trees. They're funding all kind of high-tech solutions, biological mimicry, and so that actually promote, I guess, a whole sector around technical innovations. So there's no extra money coming in really into green infrastructure or trees in any case. So you have to be a little bit aware sometimes, I think, with terms like nature-based solutions, green infrastructure planning, etc., that it takes a bit of the heart and the biology out of some of the solutions. It takes a little bit away from the fact that trees and ecosystems and nature can actually do a lot of good if well managed and if well taken care of in many ways. It doesn't all have to be high-tech. It doesn't all have to be in these fantastic schemes about stormwater regulation, etc. Because if I show this to my parents back home in Holland, they will look at me blank. They will not be interested. They're not so eager to talk about this kind of up-in-the-air, big technocratic solutions. They're more interested in this kind of things. They want to see their local tree. They want to have a personal connection to the green space. They want to walk in the street and realize, I don't know exactly what it is, but it's a fantastic street. So I think that is maybe one word of warning I would like to utter a little bit about green infrastructure. I think a lot of good has come out of it, and there's really a fantastic planning approach that has lifted green space to higher levels. But there's also a risk that we lose the connection, the basic connection between people and trees, people and nature, because it becomes all very technocratic, very far away from my back door-ish. So we need to have those both in place. So that's also why I think that urban forestry has a fantastic opportunity here to connect. Because urban forestry is about delivering, urban and community forestry are about delivering those nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, all these other things. It's really bringing down the tree to the individual level through citizen science, to good communication, to engagement. Or, and some of you might have seen this, by a tree dating site. Tree Philly has set this up. So I had one of my lonely nights one day, I think, and I went in and I filled it out, you know. I had maybe a glass of whiskey too much or so. So I filled it out and I realized I think I was teamed up with a sweet cherry tree. And you know, it sounds a bit funny, but you start actually thinking, because then they will tell you, sweet cherry tree likes a lot of water, likes drinking, and like blah, blah, blah. So you get all this kind of, so it's a bit confrontational. But actually, it's a nice way of communicating, this idea that actually trees are important to us on a very personal, very emotional level. So however much I appreciate all the good research that's being done on trees and the benefits of trees and iTree and environmental services, it comes down basically to hearts and minds and souls in the end. So we really have to make sure we make those connections, keep those connections alive, study those connections, understand them better. We have research that can do it, can really make a much richer view of that. So we try to integrate that into some of the teaching we're doing in Vancouver. I know other places in the US, and hopefully also now MSU is really picking up on that. But we realize also, and it's about training those urban forestry professionals, there's very few bachelor but also master programs. There's very few programs in the world that actually are educating urban foresters. Urban foresters in the sense of people who have a broad overview, they can understand governance, but also understand the technical issues. So there's really a need there to look at things like we were doing now in Vancouver, slowly trying to build up, combining things like community engagement, smart data modeling, planning and design, but also policy and governance issues, and trying to bring those all together in a comprehensive degree with courses that are, as we have them here now in Vancouver. And you see it really ranges from arboriculture and field camp to governance, green infrastructure and ecological restoration. But we start very much off with, for example, connecting urban forest and human health and well-being, because that is really where it all starts. So I'll leave you with a few thoughts, and I'm sorry that the last line there is almost from the paper, but I think we can talk about urban forestry 2.0 or maybe even 3.0 or higher. A lot of good has been done by our predecessors, and we have to build on that. But it's also really about us finding our place in this wider, more complex world around us, scientifically, but also in terms of societal development, and also in terms of partnerships with other professions. There are greater opportunities for green, climate change adaptation, human health, social cohesion, learning, all these things I've been talking about. But it also means that we need more research in terms of the full benefits, so not only the environmental services, but also the social ground of much of our urban forestry work earlier. How are people using green space? How do they benefit from it? Better economic aspects and models. How do we really try to capture also some of those socio-cultural issues in economic modeling? That could be very difficult. And the iTree people have really been breaking their heads over trying to find ways of bringing in things like public health, but also aesthetics. How do you bring in aesthetics in economic modeling? It's very difficult. Look more into tree diversity and resilience as well as governance. And then also, and again, the thing I've been highlighting, the fact that we are in a world that is very diverse and will be more and more diverse wherever we are in the world. It also means that the urban forest will be more and more diverse. We know that urban forest populations have changed because of people's societal changes. So how is this going to play out in the future? And finally, and I'm always making a call for that, of course, we need more partnerships and we need more transdisciplinarity in the sense that we not only have to work across disciplines and between disciplines, but we also have to work together with communities and the users of our green spaces, the users of our information, to make sure that policymakers, local communities are an integral part of our research approaches. So with that, and with a thank for your patience, I would thank you very much for your attention.